Welcome to Human School. I'm your host, Dr. Patil Armenian. After 4 years of college, 4 years of medical school, 4 years of residency, and 2 years of fellowship, I thought I was done. I did my time, got my degrees, and now I was just gonna live life. Well, think again. Some of my greatest schooling has come after my formal education was complete, and it keeps on coming. Join me at Human School, where we can learn together. I'm an emergency physician and medical toxicologist working at a large teaching hospital in California. I'm also a mom, wife, sister, daughter, and friend. Whether you work in healthcare or not, you too lead a busy life. Together, let's work on how we can thrive in all of our real-world roles. On this podcast, we'll dig deep into what it means to constantly learn and evolve, to be human. Every other week, I'll share some of my personal stories, interview inspiring people, and offer tools to help you learn more about yourself. Being on the front lines in the ER, you learn a lot about life and death. And though my philosophies were born in a busy emergency room, they can apply to anyone trying to live a joyful life here on Earth. Please listen, share, and subscribe to this podcast, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram at Human School Podcast, and feel free to let me know what topics or guests you want to hear about. And if you like the podcast, don't forget to rate and review it. Hi everyone. I took an unexpected break, but I'm really excited to be back and talking to you all about topics I'm passionate about with people who I deeply respect. One topic that I haven't talked about much yet is psychedelics. I briefly began to touch on this in episode 23 when I discussed the initial FDA Advisory Committee decision on MDMA for PTSD. But before I delve into more science in future episodes, as well as a further discussion on that decision, I want to do an acknowledgement of those who came before us, are present alongside us, and will be working with these medicines well into the future. The concept of psychedelics would not be here without the indigenous cultures around the world who are the original pharmacologists and biochemists. In this episode, I have the honor of speaking with a multi-hyphenate powerhouse, Ariel Clark. Ariel is an Odawa Anishinaabe attorney advising clients in highly regulated and emerging ecosystems. For over 15 years, Ariel has provided business, corporate, and regulatory support to organizations, nonprofits, government agencies, tribes, healthcare providers, and practitioners with an emphasis on cannabis, plant medicines, and psychedelics. Ariel takes a common-sense approach to legal advice, and her clients are heart-based, brilliant people who care about building and maintaining successful, impactful, and ethical organizations and offerings. Ariel's actively engaged in the conversation about psychedelic lawyering, which is ethical lawyering grounded in our responsibilities to all our relatives, and helping to shape policies that emphasize open source, ethical business models that honor the earth, peoples, and lineages. Ariel's a co-founder of the Psychedelic Bar Association and serves on the Psychedelic Bar Association's legacy board. She has written on rights of nature as a vehicle to protect sacred plants and traditional cultural knowledge, and regularly lectures at universities and law schools including Columbia, Yale, Harvard, UCLA, and Berkeley on biopiracy, the Nagoya Protocol, and other issues related to ecological justice, drug policy reform, and Indigenous rights. Ariel recently joined the board of Benefit Honoring, an Indigenous-led organization dedicated to building a global community rooted in Indigenous traditional lifeways and biocultural preservation. She is a member of Roots to Sky Sanctuary, a BIPOC-stewarded land-based healing and community project. She is also honored to be in study of Indigenous Peacemaking ways. She has a Bachelor of Arts from University of Michigan in Religious Studies and a JD from Berkeley Law School. And while in law school, Ariel participated with a group of other Native American law students in discussions at the United Nations for what became the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Ariel is an enrolled tribal citizen of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians and is of counsel with Calyx Law. And now let's get into our great conversation. Welcome to Human School. Today we have on with us a very special guest, Ariel Clark. Welcome, Ariel.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I'm so happy we've connected and that we get to have this conversation because you bring such a vast wealth of knowledge about a topic I don't know very much about, which is the legal world of psychedelics and so much more, which we're going to get into. But before we really get into it, Ariel, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how you got here.
Okay, I'd love to share about that. I'd like to first introduce myself in my Anishinaabe spirit name. My name is Odawa, and that means both sides of the sky woman. I am here on our ancestral land in Anishinaabe territory, which is known as Michigan. I'm an enrolled member of the Grand Traverse Band of the Ottawa and Chippewa Indians of Michigan. And I started my journey here in Michigan, and then my journey took me about 20 some years to California for law school and other adventures around all sorts of things like working in federal Indian law, working in and around psychedelics and plant medicines and on Indigenous rights. And I recently came back home, and I call the journey that I've taken the Red Road. There's a concept in like a cultural teaching in Anishinaabe culture called Mino Bamatizuin, which means many things. Most simply, living in a good way, living in a balanced and harmonious way with, love and gentleness and kindness and humility imprinted on our hearts, and remembering that we are part of this beautiful sacred hoop of life. And so I would say, this red road has been an ever deepening homecoming of that teaching. And my work as a lawyer has been a very interesting teacher as the journey has unfolded for me, because a lot of that work has been in the Western legal system, which is highly problematic. It is, the legal system of the settler colonists, and supports a lot of harm and ongoing harm for many people and the earth and the plants and the animals and our sacred waters. And it's also a very relevant framework that we all live within. So I would say my spiritual and professional paths are not distinct, that I am very grateful at this point in my life to walk an integrated path.
That's pretty amazing that you've been able to integrate those two sides into a profession that most people would think sounds so just straightforward and ordinary, like, oh, I'm a lawyer, but you've managed to really carve out your own niche within this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, the thing is that it's so interesting, sort of what society imagines lawyers to be, and also the stories that lawyers tell about themselves. So, one story that lawyers tell about themselves is, we're just objective arbiters, tools of our clients. We are not situated in any way within context or community. And it's sort of like this space between lawyers and everyone else. And that is a very Western conception. It's also not true at all. As someone who has been through very early on, I've been practicing for going on 18 years. And I saw the arc. I was very involved in the arc of cannabis law reform. And I saw how impactful lawyers were in that process. Policymakers listen to lawyers. Clients listen to lawyers. Lawyers help to shape emerging industries and ecosystems. Lawyers are leaders. The question is, what kind of leaders are we going to be? When I was sworn into the California bar, Judge Abby Abenati, who is a Yurok judge and was the first California Indian to become a lawyer, swore me into the bar. And so she said, all the things you're supposed to say will you uphold the law, all of that, set that aside, and then said the words that held me very firmly and strongly, which included things like, you have a responsibility. This is come to this work from a place of humility. You are in a place of service to community, to all of life. Remember who you are. Remember where you came from. And recently I've been participating in kind of like a lawyer study group with mostly Navajo. There's a Muskogee Creek lawyer. And it's been really beautiful to learn, for example, in Dene, Navajo culture, the role of the lawyer in that culture is to bring the parties back into honjon, which is basically the beauty way. And the lawyer isn't outside of community in any way and has a deep ethical foundation and obligation. And that's honestly like what I am most interested in for my profession, the lawyer profession, which is why, I'm one of the founding board members of the Psychedelic Bar Association, which we started about 4 years ago. And that organization is founded on a set of ethical principles. We took something called the North Star Pledge and tailored it to lawyers because of seeing, again, what happened in cannabis and the truth of lawyers' positionality within society, which is we have a tremendous influence, very much so, especially when it comes to an emerging industry. And it is a total falsehood when lawyers tell the story that they are not responsible for outcomes. That is so far from the truth. And so if we can somehow come back into a really, like if we think about set and setting for lawyering or a healthy container, it really must be a set of ethics. And that's an invitation that I hope for us all in all of our professions, because what I see over and over again, particularly in this dominant culture in this country, is just this really clear race to the bottom in every way. How can we maximize profits, extract as much as possible, extract as much from human beings and our precious life force, our bodies, our lives, our time with family, time to connect? How can we take as much from the earth to make as much for these people who are on the very top of this triangle of power and domination? And so, in our homecoming back into the hoop, into a circle, into a place where, well, really it makes me think of this Aboriginal scholar, Tyson Yunkaporta. And he said something to the effect of, all lawbreaking comes, or the first lawbreaking comes from when we put ourselves over other people or other beings. So it's how do we come back into a place of true equality? I mean, can we even say that word? And that starts with conversations around values and ethics and the meta or the deeper questions and conversations that are much more important than contract law, litigation, or these quote unquote what are called substantive areas of law. That's an old story, or at least that's my old story. I used to believe those are the substantive things, and I had no idea what ethics was. I wasn't very interested in that class in law school. But then you go into a profession, and it is very jarring, to say the least.
Yeah, and I'm sure you saw a lot of interesting things happen when you were involved in cannabis legalization world. What are some lessons that you took from those experiences that now you're bringing into the world of psychedelic law?
Well, what I learned so clearly is that, what I saw was we had a plant. There's this plant, cannabis. The spirit that went through these twin engines of government and markets. And outcomes occurred from that. And they were largely harmful outcomes. What was my clients that I worked with very early on in 2005, 6, 7, 8, 9, and the community around cannabis primarily were people who were centering the cannabis plant, who were in service to others, in service of healing. It was a very community-based thing. Then you get law and markets involved. And now what is it? It's consolidated into more and more smaller businesses are out of the picture. Tribes could never sell into the regulated cannabis market in California, which is highly problematic. Obviously, this is their land. And yet tribes were locked out of the regulated cannabis market. We worked on trying to fix that and never was able to make that fix. There were social equity programs to try to address, the fact that Black and Brown and poor communities were disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs, which is really a war on people. And those social equity programs in general are poor, doing quite poorly. Why? Well, so many reasons. Because it's not just about those opportunities, it's about these bigger issues, which is lack of access to capital, just even the community holding or lack thereof, coming down to the trauma of living in this society and the harm to the family unit. And so I guess, what did I learn? So clearly how all the interrelationships of all of these different elements of the web, really the web of policy, law, community, family, economics, and what happens when we just do more or less the same things, when we just habitually make the same choices or nearly the same choices at critical decision points that will create the same outcomes that we see. And there's this idea of, if we keep doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, that's a form of insanity. And so what I'm interested in is the alternative to the alternative. What really is, where is it that the song of love and light and beauty and kindness and gentleness, where is that song? Where is that in all of this? And so, that's a curiosity when it comes to psychedelics, because cannabis is a heartbreaker. The plant herself, her spirit is not compromised. In fact, I had a medicine dream where she told me that and more. But, the harm is not to her, it's to us human beings. And I think, to put a fine point on it, tobacco is a very good example. Look what dominant culture and the West has done with tobacco. And I wonder what will happen with MDMA. And I wonder what will happen with these other substances and medicines and sacred spirits. Do we human beings, do we know how to hold things in deep reverence and respect? I think this dominant culture does not teach us that.
Or are we just going to break things over and over again?
Well, this is where we look to the wisdom traditions, and it's a deep paradigm reframe that is being, it's the opportunity that is being presented and prophesized about as well in my tribe and other tribes. This is a deep time.
Yeah, it really is. And I completely resonate with the concept of the circle, because it's the more we see that everything is interrelated, the more everybody has to communicate with each other. For example, I'm a doctor. I'm not in the legal world at all, but I realize that, all of our different groups need to have open lines of communication and collaboration so that we can actually have even more meaningful, substantive change and progress.
Yeah, absolutely. UCLA is doing some really cool interdisciplinary work around psychedelics, and specifically within the context of nature. So have you heard about this?
I just read about it last night.
It's beautiful. Yeah. So that's good. We need that. Exactly. We need these interdisciplinary conversations. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned UCLA doing some really cool collaborative visions, and I think that's the Semel Institute Living Lab. What do you know about that?
I know that it is within the backdrop of nature. And I think that is such an important starting point for us all, no matter where we are. We're in such a moment of ecological crisis that the first inquiry in every moment needs to be, how is this decision impacting nature, which we are really not separate from nature. That's a Western concept, but the natural world, all of our other relatives. And so I really love that UCLA is framing this interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary inquiry, conversations, discussions with psychedelics in the context of nature.
Yeah, it sounds like they're going to convert the whole rooftop of a building into a living roof, a garden, kind of similar to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, but more spaces you can walk around, sit in, like get your feet in the dirt. And they're going to be doing ecological medicine research as well as psychedelic research there, which makes total sense. I'm a big fan of the science that proves something you already knew, right? You're like, of course. So they're quoting studies saying, well, they've had these psychiatric studies that show that when you have people with depression and you get their feet in the dirt and you get them out in nature, they do better. And it's like, of course, we
Yeah.
are a part of nature. Thanks for that. But some people need to see that type of concrete research. And it's like, thanks for telling us what we already know. Now let's move forward with this. And that's what they're doing. I think it's going to be a really great next step.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just also mention that my participation in the first convening was around essentially plants as sentient beings, as having agency, and kind of decentering humans. That's my inquiry these days. We have all sorts of supremacy that is very problematic, one of them being human supremacy. So, it's how do we get ourselves remember that we are one, the human family is one family on the sacred hoop, and we have all these other families, these different plant families, these different animal families, right? So I really appreciated that they are open to really what is a different worldview, and hopefully the coming worldview, the worldview to come that is held as that which is dominant for our very survival.
Yeah. And this podcast is called Human School. It's because I just feel like we're just in this, I don't know, figuring out how to be humans within this grander framework. And so it sounds like that's one of the things you're learning in your human school right now. What other lessons do you feel you've been learning lately or have learned from your mentors that you felt have really helped you along the way?
There is a certain prayer that is made, different prayers to the water. It started with an Anishinaabe elder, grandmother Josephine, and that started maybe 20 years ago or so. And many people, both native and non-native, will walk for the water. These are called Nibi walks. About a year ago, I walked around part of what is called Lake Superior, but in Anishinaabe and Sharon Day led that walk. And I mentioned that because, I chose to go on this Nibi walk, and other people can do that. So look up Nibi walk and go and walk at the next walk, to be in community together, to pray for the water, to connect with the water. Women in my community, women carry the water, women hold that element. And I'm still learning what it means to be in relationship with the water. But this was a really beautiful starting point. So my prayers every morning, I pray for the water, for Nibi. I sing some songs and I play my drum, and to connect in that way, so that will help guide my decisions, my words throughout every day, coming from that good place. And so really, being on that walk, being asking to be in relationship with the water, asking to be in relationship with others who are water protectors and land defenders. That's been very impactful And then I would also say I've been learning a lot about Indigenous peacemaking. So you've probably heard about restorative justice, different restorative justice programs. Thank goodness that those have taken more hold across the country in, regular prosecutors' offices, for example, in DC. They have a huge restorative justice program. So, youth are diverted if they so choose, and factually things work out. They will go through a restorative justice process. And restorative justice comes from Indigenous peacemaking, which is really getting us out of the punitive system, the you're bad and you did this thing and you deserve to be punished. And now you need to go into a cell that's, a cage, and forever you are bad. And that's what you're told. And then that goes into your psyche. And because of our English language, the way that we're so fixated on nouns and adjectives, that is what you are, and you believe that's what you are. And that's what society tells you. That way of being, of excluding, really is another way that this dominant culture is very harmful to human beings and to souls and to actual healing, coming back into harmony with oneself and social harmony and personal growth. And peacemaking means many things, but I would say peacemaking means very much that: spiritual growth and promoting social harmony. So learning about that from a couple different elders, from the former Chief Justice of the Navajo Supreme Court, Justice Robert Yazzie, and a Tlingit elder, Cheryl Fairbanks. And that's been really beautiful, because I was raised, also in this dominant culture, and these messages are very strong of, punishment and all of that. So that's been really beautiful. It's really also been very liberating and freeing, and created a lot more space for love, and love for myself and love for others, and compassion and understanding. So
It's beautiful. I too was raised in this dominant culture, and as a first generation immigrant, and everything presented was so black and white. I felt when I was growing up, and it's not, and it's beautiful to see that. And I love everything that you just said. Now, I wanted to get into a little bit of what is going on in the psychedelic landscape right now. There's so many different things that we can get into. But first off, psychedelics are ancient plants and fungi and ancient medicines, and used by native peoples across the world for millennia. And now we're in a space where people can almost like freely start talking about them again, especially, in medicine. I never learned about these things. We never talked about it. Even in toxicology, it was kind of taboo until really a few years ago. And so as that world opens up, first, how do we ensure that the right things are happening for the communities that these powerful compounds have come from?
Oh, that's so layered. That's so involved. And, thank you for asking that as the first question, because that's often not the first question that people who are acculturated in this sort of dominant taking culture are taught to ask, and I remind myself over and over to give grace, because there is a lack of cultural teachings. I'm calling it cultural teachings because I guess it's more like values. A lot of people are not taught about responsibility. This kind of goes back to law. They think about, what's my right? I have a right to do this. I get to have this. Not, and what is the greater picture here? What is the thread, the fabric, the web that leads me to be able to be in relationship in this moment with something, and who also holds that dear? But your question was, how can we do it right? The first thing would be to slow down. We are in a very fast-paced, rushing society. but we need to slow down. Otherwise, we will replicate the same thing that we have done, the West has done, around not just sacred plants and traditional knowledge around psychedelics, but this has happened in all other sorts of industries. This has happened in the food industry, the makeup industry, all sorts of other products that come from places on planet Earth and uses where Indigenous people and local communities had traditional knowledge about that particular plant, for example, or as international law speaks of those things, genetic resources. And so this is just, it's another outcropping of the same thing, which is people in the West, the very intense gaze of the West is now on psychedelics. And when that happens, there is a desire to just take it and say you discovered it. Oh, I discovered this land. I discovered this thing. I discovered this teaching. Without any sort of context. I mean, that makes sense too, because that's been part of the American experience. As people come to this country, as people are acculturated into you're Black, you're white, you're Indian, any sort of history had to be cut off. That's a prerequisite to being an American on some level. That's shifting a lot. But, we are supposed to be ahistorical. And so people are taught that. So to them, the psychedelics are, I'm discovering the psychedelics. This is something that's new. And there isn't any context into other cultures. So I think it's, number one, a slowing down and recognizing that. And then really, I think we can look to certain international laws as at least starting points for what next steps. So international laws such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the Nagoya Protocol, as well as the recent Biopiracy Treaty, all talk about the need for consent, free, prior, and informed consent before something is even studied, let alone commercialized. But what does that mean when we say that? That means free means if I'm an academic person or a CEO of a company or a researcher, that first I need to go and ask the local community or Indigenous community without coercion. That's what free means. No coercion. Ask, I want to study this thing. I understand you use this substance in this way. I want to study that. And it has to be informed. So real information about what I want to do with it. And it has to be before, right? Free, prior, and informed. It has to be before I actually do the thing. And then you have this consent. And so we have these frameworks that create a sort of roadmap on how you go and approach a community to say, I want to access this thing that is really yours. I hesitate to use the word their property because that is a Western concept. But if we have to use Western words, it is their property. It's their cultural property. It's their traditional knowledge. And so it's that slowing down and that seeking of consent that is really what should be happening. That's really what needs to happen. And that's really not happening in most cases because there is I think there's this feeling of feeling so compelled. We're in this mental health crisis. So many people are suffering. We need these solutions now. But I would say as I continue to work in and around this community now going on, 7 or 8 years, and deepening on my own path, I'll also say that it's how we do something that matters. And that even means it matters to what the medicine that we create will be like, right? So slowing down, seeking consent, being in right relationship, even learning what does that even mean? And that's an ongoing conversation. That is what will create health. It's not creating another thing and putting it in a bottle or regulating it as quickly as possible so people can grab it for an answer. That's again, we're just touching the top layer and we're not getting into the deeper layers. How we get into the deeper layers that will actually create the shifts where our actions are guided by gentleness and love. Our walk on the earth is guided by gentleness and love, means that we start doing that in every way and in this moment. And really, it's incumbent on people who are involved in psychedelics, if really what the goal is healing, mind expansion. Generally, that tends to be bettering oneself. If those things are the goals, then we need to center these collective concerns and considerations and do that deep work of being in relationship cross-culturally, which requires a slower process. It took, so if you ever drank rooibos tea, I love rooibos tea.
Mhm.
So rooibos tea comes from the Khoisan people in Africa. And so what had happened is, all of these, I think primarily Europeans, went and cultivated and took rooibos tea and sold it all over the world. And then at some point, the Khoisan said, this is not right. This is our cultural property. And so they went through a process with the entire rooibos industry. And it took 10 years, and they came up with basically a benefit sharing agreement. So I think 2% of profits from rooibos tea goes to these community trusts for the benefit of the Khoisan people. That is how things need to be structured. And it may be that you approach a community and say, we want to study this thing or commercialize this thing. And they say no. And that's the end of it too. It doesn't always mean, oh, we're going to throw some money in your direction and then that's okay. That was a 10-year process to come up with that. And that is a deeply healed way of moving. I'm not saying I don't know the ins and outs of that particular process, but at least one where it's not just taking and monetizing and excluding.
At least there's a good example there of how something can be done. And I love what you said about slowing down, because that's actually one of the things I've been thinking about lately regarding all of this. So, for example, for me, I think the biggest example, and this might be controversial, but the FDA new drug application for MDMA being approved for use in PTSD. I think seems many people in the psychedelic world have been in an uproar over the FDA subcommittee that voted pretty overwhelmingly that they didn't think that it seemed efficacious or that the safety data was there. I talked about this in another podcast episode. I'm going to be talking about this more, so we don't have to get into all details. But one of the things that kind of kept coming back to me was, this seems very fast. And I know it doesn't seem fast to the people doing the research, because they started doing this research over a decade ago. But the FDA process seems very fast. And it seems to me like it should be okay to slow down and address these specific concerns. But people are just wanting to charge through, saying, well, we have this, PTSD disaster. And it's very true. I just want to help people, but I think it's okay to do it right and really address the concerns that people have, instead of just trying to push everything through full court press because they think they're scared and they think this is the only chance we're going to get.
Yeah. Yep. Slowing down is a place that I would say I learned the wisdom in watching also what happened with cannabis and other things. I think it's a part of our hurried, youth obsessed, rushing culture that is so fixated on that kind of way of being. And it's like, I've long wondered, like, when will we again value, this slowing down and deep consideration and patience, and almost like the wisdom, almost like the elder path. It's like we want to rush and get things done and be heard immediately. And yes, I agree. I understand, people are suffering. And also, we can create more suffering in the way we do things. And that's usually what we do.
We don't want to create more suffering. It's like the opposite. Now, and I don't know if you know about this recent bit in the news, but I thought it was really interesting that the Church of Eagle and Condor it seems just basically granted a DEA license to import and use ayahuasca. And this is a United States based church. And so that was seen as a win, I would say, in the ayahuasca column. However, as we know, there's many sides to every story. And there was a response letter issued from multiple organizations representing the Shipibo Conibo people of the Peruvian Amazon that kind of denounced this as, you are not of our tradition. And so, first off, what do you think about what happened with basically the DEA allowing them to use ayahuasca, and then this response? And I know there's a lot of facets to this story.
Yeah, so I think it's important to start with the backdrop of the Church of the Eagle and the Condor and the laws that we find ourselves in this country. We unfortunately have the Controlled Substances Act, which many of the psychedelics are Schedule 1 controlled substances. And I think it's pretty irrefutable at this point that we know that the Controlled Substances Act was passed really to, quote unquote, deal with the hippie and the black problem. And so for racial and social control reasons, for power, really, domination, and not based on science or well-being of the broader populace. And so I want to say first that the fear that people have in this country of, drinking ayahuasca, for example, that is a Schedule 1 controlled substance, unless they are part of the UDV or Santo Daime, which are the only two churches that actually have a DEA exemption, that's a real one. And it doesn't happen very often, certainly for just drinking ayahuasca. We see situations where ayahuasca is seized at the border, and there are situations where people who are transporting ayahuasca have also been put into prison or jail and have to go through, that criminal process. So there is a reality there that is really deeply problematic. And I just want to name that as a first thing. I also want to name the fact that our legal system, as I mentioned earlier, talking about rights versus responsibilities, or, that kind of way of thinking. Our legal system in this country necessarily means, because of the cultural training and just the culture in the United States and what people are taught in law school, that really you are trained to think about your client only. What will be the winning argument in this case? How and in the more egregious circumstances, how much can I get away with? How do I frame this so that I can win? And I just say that because that's really how lawyers are trained, right? You are advocating for your client. It's not your client and other communities that this situation may impact. And there's a sense of responsibility, right? It's much more of a kind of like individualistic position to be in. So what happened with the Church of the Eagle and the Condor is that essentially they sued the Customs and Border Patrol for seizing ayahuasca sacrament. And the church is a syncretic religion that says that they are also based in Shipibo tradition. And there was a settlement. And through that settlement, it was concluded that they are now essentially the third church that's able to legally drink ayahuasca. So the letter that you're referring to, the Shipibo letter, I want to say a few things. First, it was, I don't know if you noticed this, but it was written to U.S. embassies, various government departments in Peru, various international bodies like the United Nations, obviously also to the individuals who are involved in the Church and the Eagle and the Condor and the church itself, and then the Attorney General of the U.S., the DEA, right? So it's this huge sweeping letter. And what it said in a very strongly worded way was essentially what we spoke about earlier on. There was no consent in this case. We did not consent to our medicines and our traditions to be used in this way in this case, and it's been appropriated. Basically, our traditional knowledge is being appropriated. And they also noted in this letter the international laws that I mentioned earlier. I mean, they mentioned genetic resources, but that phrase is found in international laws. And basically saying, look, there are international standards that discuss what you need to go through if you want to access someone else's cultural knowledge or genetic resource. And that process did not happen here. And then it closed with the statement that they intend to file an international criminal complaint. So one can hear those concerns. I guess what I'm saying is those are very loud concerns. Those are concerns from people within these communities, leaders, organizations within the Chippewa community. And maybe I'll just pause there.
Well, I think it also comes back to that concept of informed consent, which is, yeah, maybe somebody from that church went and spent time there with those people, but was there proper informed consent of, well, now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do this thing and I'm going to ask for your permission. So just because you spend time with a tribe or a community doesn't mean that they have given you consent for use of their sacrament, for example. So informed consent is, I think, very important, and we can do better and let people know what we are using their information for.
Yeah. And, I'll just also say, I don't know what happened in this situation specifically. I'm curious to know. I see it as a really important opportunity to have a deeper conversation around consent, because there are also a lot of complications or things that are, it's not necessarily straightforward. Who needs to give the consent?
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like? But certainly a lesson that we can gather in this moment without knowing the specifics here is that it is really important to be very thorough, particularly when you're going to file a case. This is probably not the first time that, we'll see something like this. I hope this means that people are much more aware and conscientious and thorough and slow to go through really what is a true consultation process, a seeking, an asking, and then some sort of an agreement. It could also be the case that here, the Church of the Eagle and the Condor could have done everything that they could possibly do. I don't know the answer to that. They could have done that. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. But it's certainly, based on this letter, it certainly sounds like maybe either not or not to the level that is required. And so may we learn from this. May we all learn from this. And I hope it is a learning experience, unfortunately, at the cost, once again, probably, of Indigenous communities.
I think those are very good lessons of just be thorough, do your research, be intentional, slow. These are kind of some of the key themes I'm taking away from what you're saying. Is there anything else you want to add about this emerging field, emerging legal field that you think people should know in terms of psychedelics and in Indigenous rights and reciprocities?
Every Indigenous community is different. And so that's why every community has a different process that they go through. So a Western business person, for example, can't do the normal running roughshod and cut and paste in every scenario. It's a relational approach. And these types of processes to even ask for consent have to be Indigenous-led. And that means sometimes part of that process is the Indigenous community goes and prays together for an entire year to consider one step in the process, right? So it's a cross-cultural conversation. I suggest people, honestly, there are organizations that work in these kinds of dialogues that help to facilitate these types of dialogues. I highly suggest, hiring and working with organizations and people who understand how to make these approaches, because then they can also help with the consent process if that conversation starts to unfold, and really ensuring that it's well documented, that it's very transparent, that the relevant community is involved, so that if at the end, let's say you go through a few-year process and there is an agreement in place, there is a fulsome record that shows everything that has been done to support equal negotiations and conversations, and that consent was freely and given from a good place.
That's very good advice. So I thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Ariel. You're a wealth of wisdom. We barely scratched the surface. I feel like we have so much more we could talk about. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Miigwech.
Please like, subscribe, share, and download the podcast. And again, you can find us at Human School Podcast on Instagram. I'd like to thank Dr. Zac Efron for the theme music. And I'd just like to make a general disclaimer that any of the institutions I work for, including Community Regional Medical Center, UCSF, UCSF Fresno, and American Ambulance, have nothing to do with any of my thoughts or opinions. And so we'll kindly leave them out of this. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.